Welcome to Sleep Horror, where true horror stories will make your heart race. Once you've listened, tell me which story you loved the most by dropping a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe so I can bring you more episodes.
The title of the story: The Ghostly Reflection at Blackmoor Manor.
I, Anna Mueller, a graduate student from Berlin specializing in Gothic architecture, arrived at Blackmoor Manor just as dusk smothered the Inverness skyline. The damp November air clung to my wool coat. Gargoyles, their wings chipped and eroded by centuries of highland storms, glared from the eaves. The cold stone walls exuded a dankness that stung my nostrils. Before slipping my camera bag from my shoulder, I paused to photograph the facade. Moss-encrusted carvings, frost-flecked mullioned windows, and a grand oak door cracked at its seams. My assignment was straightforward: document the decaying beauty of a manor abandoned since the early 1800s and record any local lore tied to its downfall. Inside, the sharp scent of peat smoke drifted through frost-covered window panes. A neighbor's hearth fire must have burned nearby, sending tendrils of warmth that contrasted the chill settling in my bones. The golden lamplight of my handheld lantern cast long, flickering shadows over the courtyard's mossy cobblestones. I moved from room to room with methodical caution. The once opulent drawing room, its tattered drapes yellowed with age. The library, where empty shelves stood like skeletal ribs. And the dining hall, where a grand mahogany table, now warped and cracked, stood beneath a shattered chandelier. As midnight approached, I installed myself in a small chamber off the west wing. Outside, distant church bells tolled from a decommissioned chapel more than a mile away. Echoes that sounded less like timekeeping and more like mournful wails. My first night passed without incident. No footsteps echoed behind me. No doors creaked open on their own. Only the wind, whistling through broken slats, kept me company.
On the evening of November 3rd, I returned to the manor just after 5 p.m. The sky had deepened into bruised purples. Damp fog curled around my ankles as I reopened the iron latch. Inside, the manor felt colder than before. My breath puffed in halos of steam. I switched on my lantern, and its trembling glow revealed peeling wallpaper stamped with faded fleur-de-lis patterns. The corridor stretched before me like a yawning maw, swallowing each footstep. Ahead, a boarded-up door bore deep gouge marks, as though held shut against something desperate to get out. I paused. My hands trembled so much I could barely adjust the lens on my camera. The floorboards beneath me creaked. My heart thudded, though I was alone. I raised the camera and fired multiple shots of the peeling walls, hoping the flash would banish any lingering shadows. In the flash frame, I thought I glimpsed a pale shape crouched at the far end of the hallway. But when the light died, only darkness remained. Moving on, I ventured to the old billiards room. Everything lay coated in dust. a green felt table patched with holes, billiard balls scattered like lost teeth. In one corner stood a tall mirror, its frame carved with thorny vines. As I raised my lantern, the glass reflected not only my own anxious face, but also something slipping from one corner to the next. For a heartbeat, I saw a slender silhouette, dark hair hanging in damp tangles, shoulders hunched. I blinked. The shape vanished. My pulse quickened. I swallowed hard. "Hello?" I called, voice trembling. Only silence answered. A faint scratching scratched behind the boarded-up door, a sound like fingernails raking raw wood. I froze, every nerve alight. The scratching stopped. I took another picture. Nothing appeared in the shot. By 8 p.m., I retreated to the drawing room beside the grand fireplace, where the hearth lay cold, ashes long gone. I set up a station, camera on tripod, extra batteries in my satchel, and a small notebook for observations. As I sipped lukewarm tea brought from the village earlier, I jotted down notes. Corridors feel alive. Floorboards shift underfoot. My lantern flickers without explanation. Outside, the wind moaned through rotten shutters. The gust rattled panes, sounding like the rasp of fabric brushing skin. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders, though the room felt drafty in every direction. At 10:30 p.m., I heard the faint echo of footsteps above me, soft, deliberate treads on the second floor wooden planks. My fingers tightened on the lantern handle. "Probably a rat," I whispered, attempting calm. I rose, camera raised, and edged toward the staircase. The steps groaned beneath my weight, echoing up like hollow bones. I climbed, peered into the darkness above. No movement, no sound, except my own ragged breathing. Perhaps James was right. Some part of the manor refused to die peacefully. Once on the second floor, I followed a narrow passage toward the west wing, which local villagers called the Cursed Corridor. Here, the walls loomed closer, the ceiling drooped as though burdened by centuries of sorrow. The single candle I'd lit on a windowsill sputtered, as though caught in a ghostly breath. Its flame cast shifting shadows that danced like specters. I aimed my camera at the nearest doorway. Through the lens, I glimpsed tapers of light far down the hall, though I held no candle. "Impossible," I muttered. The hallway stretched before me like a bottomless pit. A sudden thump behind me sent my heart slamming. I spun. Only the boarded-up door loomed. The scratching had returned, more frantic now, like someone clawing from the inside. I took 3 steps forward, then stopped dead. In the low glow of my lantern, I saw a mahogany-framed portrait hung above a derelict mantel. The frame's gilded edges were tarnished. In its center, a woman's face stared back at me, pale, hollow-eyed, her dark curls framing high cheekbones. But it was not the face that startled me. It was the uncanny sense that this portrait was looking at me, and that, perhaps impossibly, her features matched mine. My own lashes fluttered. My heart thudded so hard I thought it might echo through the manor. I fumbled for my camera, backing away, but as I raised it, the portrait's eyes seemed to shift. I stumbled, almost dropping my lantern,
The single candle at the hall's end flared violently, then died, plunging the corridor into pitched blackness. My breath caught in my throat. I ran my fingers along the wall, groping until I found the nearest chamber door. Just as I pushed it open, a cold gust blew in, extinguishing the lantern, leaving me in pitch black. I dropped to my knees, praying for the matches in my pocket.
By midnight on November 4th, only the faint glow of moonlight filtered through the frost-smeared window panes in my appointed study chamber. My lantern lay broken at the threshold, its glass shattered. I struck a match with trembling fingers. Its light trembled before igniting. The match flared, revealing the room's sparse furnishings: a battered oak desk, a chair missing one leg, and a cracked oil lamp, its wick inert. I blew out the match. The darkness roared around me. Then, with a trembling breath, I relit the lamp. Its golden glow cast macabre shadows that flickered like living things against the peeling wallpaper. Driven by dread and curiosity, I rose and crept across the warped floorboards toward the hearth, where the portrait still hung. Now its presence felt alive, eyes tracking me. I reached a shaking hand toward the frame. My fingers brushed damp canvas. I pried the portrait free. Behind it, a secret latch clicked, revealing a narrow door set into the wall. I backed away, lantern raised. Heart pounding, I gripped the doorknob and turned it. The door swung open to reveal a steep stairway descending into black void. A rancid smell rose, like moldy peat mixed with the faint trace of old incense. I hesitated. My mind thundered, "Don't go." But something compelled me. I descended. Each step groaned beneath my weight. The stairway spat me out into a small underground chamber lined with rough stone. In the center lay a warped oak coffin, its lid nearly split. Patches of mold clung to its surface. A low moan echoed from within. My hands shook so violently I dropped the lantern, but it landed upright, flame intact. I picked up the lantern. The light quivered as I approached the coffin. With the strength of terror, I shoved the lid aside. A pale figure with sunken eyes and tattered linen robes lay inside. Its skeletal fingers reached up as though begging for release. My breath caught. Memories flooded. Villagers whispered warnings of a woman buried alive for witchcraft. I stumbled back, every nerve on fire. The apparition rose, and in that moment I recognized her. Her face bore my own features. High cheekbones, damp, dark curls framing hollow eyes. My scream caught in my throat. A gale rattled the mullioned windows above. The lantern's light danced wildly. The woman's lips curled into a cruel, knowing smile. She whispered my name in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The walls constricted, as though the manor itself recoiled. I spun and fled up the stairway, limbs numb. Black smoke curled around my ankles as I burst into the first-floor corridor.
My feet pounded across the cold floors toward the oak door out front. I emerged into the courtyard just as the clock from the old chapel struck 12:30 a.m., its hollow tone resonating like a death knell. I paused under the pale moonlight, panting. Behind me, Blackmoor Manor's windows glowed faintly. In one upstairs window, I thought I saw her, a silhouette, hair plastered to her pale face, staring right at me. I grabbed my camera from my bag and dared a photograph. The flash lit the Manor's facade for an instant. In that instant, I saw the reflection of her face in the broken glass. The same features as mine, eyes hollow and accusing. I turned and fled down the misted path, my boots splashing through icy puddles. The wind whipped around me, carrying a final whisper. "Stay with me." I froze for a heartbeat. No one else was there. My breath rushed hot in my ears. When I dared glance back, Blackmoor Manor stood silent, its gargoyles glowering, its windows dark. But the portrait's image lingered in my mind, her face painted 2 centuries before. And a dreadful question: when did I become her reflection?
The title of the story echoes on the Whitby moors. I never believed in ghosts until the wind off the North Sea shivered through Ravensbrook Hall, and I smelled peat smoke where no fire burned. My name is Olivia Carter, 29, an architectural photographer from Portland, Maine. Field and Hearth magazine sent me to Whitby to capture honest decay, and my editor, my cousin Lucas Whitman, who once rewired Abbey ruins in Yorkshire, warned me that the manor hums after dark. I laughed then. I was still laughing when I swung my rental hatchback onto the rutted cliff road. The storm had stripped the moorland of birdsong. Lightning exposed the manor in stark white, Jacobean gables blackened by centuries of salt wind, stone gargoyles polished slick by rain, mullioned windows kicked in by vandals and gulls. My phone read 23:47 when I crossed the threshold. Wet slate tiles clacked beneath my boots. Inside, the sharp scent of peat drifted through corridors whose oak beams groaned like distant thunder. Green lichen veined the walls. In the vestibule, frost-rimmed portraits seemed to weep condensation. I told myself each detail would photograph beautifully. Yet every time my shutter clicked, something shifted. A soft tap behind me. A sigh in the rafters. Old houses settle, I thought. Still, the skin at the nape of my neck prickled, as if unseen eyes tracked me from canvas to canvas.
I began with the great hall, tracing light paint with my flashlight to set long exposures. The beam danced over fluted pilasters, gnawed by rot, and a forgotten banquet table furred with gray mold. Just as I released the shutter, a single, muffled church bell tolled far off in the fog. I flinched. Whitby's St. Mary's had removed its bells for restoration months ago. The sound vibrated in my sternum, settling somewhere behind my ribs. Focus, Liv. I advanced deeper. The corridor beyond narrowed like a throat. Rain spattered glass panes threw back warped reflections. In one, I glimpsed a tall figure in a dark coat standing directly behind me. I spun, nothing but dust motes eddying in my light. The portrait of a 17th century nobleman stared over my shoulder with fresh gleam in his eyes. A door slammed at the far end. Short, punchy footsteps, tap, 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 scurried overhead. I called out, voice echoing. Only the wind whistled through broken, leaded windows like disembodied voices in answer. I steadied my breathing and photographed the grand staircase, carved balusters wrapped in cobweb lace, treads bowed by centuries of grief. Halfway up, a step creaked under a weight not my own. My heartbeat banged in staccato rhythm with my shutter. I tightened the camera strap around my wrist as though leather could tether courage.
On the landing, I found a smashed lantern, still slick with paraffin. The air carried an acrid tang of burned candles. Fresh, impossible. My flashlight flickered. Its beam caught a jagged crack in the plaster that looked disturbingly like a grin. Past the servants' gallery, I pushed a warped oak door. It fought me, then yielded with a wet gasp, exhaling musty, damp stone mixed with the faint trace of old incense. A library revealed itself, shelves collapsing under worm-eaten tomes, a spiral of wet footprints, bare, human, led from the threshold across dust-thick parquet. Their water gleamed in my light, evaporating at the edges as though they had just been made. I followed. The prince stopped before a sealed pine panel in the wall, its seams packed with candle wax. My pulse drummed. With the edge of my tripod, I levered the panel free. Cold, stagnant air belched out, carrying a whisper, or perhaps the sigh of ancient timber. I forced my flashlight inside. A narrow passageway descended like a gullet into blackness. My rational mind screamed, "Turn back!" My photographer's instinct, and something deeper, almost hypnotic, pulled me forward. Steps spiraled down to a hidden study, lined in crimson flock wallpaper, bleached now to rusty brown. Brass sconces, extinguished for centuries, jutted from the walls. At the far end stood an easel, draped in a cobwebbed sheet.
I drew closer. The must grew thicker, laced with salt wet sea air, though the cliffs lay 2 miles distant. When I yanked the sheet free, dust bloomed into my lungs. There she was, an enormous oil portrait, 6 feet high, lit by a stray moonbeam slicing through cracks overhead. The subject, rendered with impossible realism, was a woman of perhaps 30, skin pale as chalk, hair swept back in 1620s fashion.
Her face was my own. Underneath, a tarnished brass plate read. My breath froze, white in the lamplight. I reached out, not touching, just hovering, and saw that tiny beads of varnish were sliding down the canvas like tears. Behind me, the muffled bell tolled a second time, closer. The wet footprints reappeared, leading toward me now, glistening across the oaken floor. I stepped back, the portrait looming larger, as though leaning to meet me. "Honora?" I whispered, absurdly. The sconces erupted in green flame. A pressure like deep water weight crushed my chest. Wind shrieked through the cracked ceiling, whipping my hair across my eyes. In the emerald light, the library's dust clouds danced like funeral shrouds. Footprints halted inches from my boots. I smelled brine and decay, a tomb cracked open at low tide. My camera dangled useless in shaking hands.
The bell struck a third time, louder, inside the walls. With it came a hiss of whispering voices. "Olivia, Honora, return." The portrait's painted eyes glowed phosphorescent, pupils dilating like a predator's. I staggered back, shoulders hitting the study's desk, papers scattered, ship manifests dated November 13th, 1624, listing Honora Carter as presumed drowned. A final crack split the roof. Rainwater cascaded in, hammering the floor in icy sheets. Green flames sputtered, went black. Total darkness, except for the quicksilver flicker of lightning through ruined rafters. Then, before me, a figure coalesced from seawater and shadow. She stood my height, wearing a sodden 17th century gown. Seaweed clung to her sleeves, salt crystals glittered in her hair. Her face matched mine detail for detail, but her eyes were hollow tidal pools reflecting stormy sky. My voice failed. I lifted the camera, reflex, and pressed the shutter. Click. The flash revealed her reaching hand, pale fingers webbed with algal slime. Click. She floated closer, soaking the floorboards that creaked under her weightless step. Click. Each flash stuttered against blackness. "Why?" I croaked. Her mouth opened, no sound, only the echo of distant surf pounding cave walls. Yet in my mind bloomed a memory not mine, a woman locked in this very study as the tide swallowed the cliffs, sacrificed to protect a family secret, betrayed, forgotten. My lungs burned with the salt water she had swallowed 3 centuries ago. Lightning flared. She lunged. Cold flooded me, a riptide yanking soul from flesh. For a heartbeat, I saw both of us, her drawn into my skin, me into hers, a mirror turning inside out. My camera clattered, firing one last blind shot. The bell tolled once more, impossibly loud. Morning patrols found Ravensbrook Hall charred at its core, as if scoured by green fire. My rental car sat empty outside,
My gear lay scattered in the library, waterlogged. Only a single photograph survived on the memory card. A grainy flash image of the study. In its center stands a lone woman in Jacobean dress, her face obscured by motion blur, while behind her the portrait canvas is empty, its paint dissolved to runnels of black and green. They searched the cliffs for me, but the sea kept her secrets. Sometimes, when the wind is right, locals say you can still hear a shutter click on the moors, followed by a breathless, terrified gasp.
The title of the story echoes beneath Ravensbrook Hall. I never believed a camera could record what the eye should never see until 11:47 p.m. on November 13th, 2024, when I crossed the salt-slick threshold of Ravensbrook Hall, a deserted Jacobean manor perched above the cliffs south of Whitby, England. The assignment sounded routine. The magazine wanted honest decay for a winter feature, and I, Olivia Carter of Portland, Maine, had spent 5 years making ruins pose for my lens. My British fixer, Henry Loxley, swore the place was structurally sound, then vanished back to town with the rental van, promising to return by dawn. The courtyard greeted me with rain-dark gargoyles leering from gables, their stone fangs gleaming like wet bone. Aged oak beams groaned overhead, the sound merging with the distant tolling of a long decommissioned church bell. Peat smoke, impossible here, clung to the damp air. Still, the architecture was exquisite, and duty outweighed unease. I unpacked my tripod in the great hall, its frost-filmed portraits watching in mute judgment. The floorboards, warped by centuries of damp, creaked beneath every cautious step, yet the manor felt dormant, almost apologetic, until the lantern I had left unlit flared to life on its own, spilling gold light across moss-slicked flagstones and sending my pulse skittering like trapped moths.
A photographer trusts her senses. Tonight, mine conspired against me. I approached the inexplicably lit lantern. Its flame guttered blue, then steadied as if inhaling. The sharp scent of peat smoke thickened, mingling with a musty tang of damped stone and old incense. My gloves squeaked against the camera body. I raised the viewfinder, framing the vaulted ceiling. Through the lens, I glimpsed a shadow flowing against the grain of light. Impossible physics, like smoke poured through water. I lowered the camera. Nothing. My chest tightened. Then, behind me, the rasp of fabric, as though a skirt brushed dry leaves. I spun. Only moonlight strobed through broken mullioned windows. The wind's wail threading the corridors like disembodied voices. Drafts, I whispered, though no air stirred my fringe. I forced myself to continue. Wide-angle exposures of the banquet hall, macro shots of carved cherubs peeling from the stair rail. Each shutter snap felt louder, the manor answering with its own rhythm.
Floorboards groaned when I stood still, fell silent when I walked. The pattern reversed nature, like a heartbeat out of sync. Mid-gallery, my LED panel died, plunging the corridor into amber glow, cast solely by that uninvited lantern. Its light flickered over portraits filmed with frost, droplets thawing along the painted cheeks as though the canvases wept. In one frame, a woman in jet-black mourning dress seemed to lean forward, eyes bright with fresh grief. The plate bore a name, Elsbeth Fairclough, Lady of Ravensbrook, 1882-1884.
The camera screen flashed white noise. When the static cleared, I saw my reflection, not the room, staring back but garbed in Victorian silk, my own eyes ringed in coal dust shadows. I slammed the preview shut. My lungs burned. I tasted metal on my tongue. A corridor forked right, narrower, paneled in worm-eaten oak. There, a lantern I had never touched bobbed ahead of me, as if carried by an unseen hand. Illogic urged pursuit. Each step echoed twice, once beneath my boots, once softer, half a pace behind. Footsteps of someone shorter. Henry. My voice fractured the hush. Only the wind whistled through a distant crack, voice-like, yet speechless. The passage ended at a door barred in diagonal planks. Rust rasped as I tugged. Wood splintered, granting entry to a chapel no blueprint had shown. Stained glass lay shattered on the pews like fallen wings. An acrid tang of burned tallow haunted the air, and soot-black candles clung to iron sconces. At the far wall hung a cracked mirror framed in tarnished gilt. My lantern-borne shadow wavered across it. I lifted the camera, half to shield my vision. Through the lens I saw the chapel intact, windows whole, pews polished, and a congregation of blurred grey figures who bowed their heads to a woman at the altar, myself again, though dressed in Lady Elspeth's mourning lace. Her lips, my lips, moved in silent homily. One by one the shades raised their faces, eyeless hollows, mouths forever O-shaped in grief. The camera slipped from numb fingers, shattering on flagstone. Without its mechanical click, the chapel breathed. Boards swelled beneath my boots. Cold exhaled from the walls. A pale handprint blossomed in frost on the mirror's glass. Fingers long, nails cracked. Another appeared, overlapping my own reflection's face, smearing features into formlessness. A voice, almost tender, whispered behind my ear, "You see me." I whirled. Empty pews. Panic overrode training. I fled, boots skidding on moss, the Manor's passages knotting into a maze. Church bells tolled once, twice, thrice, yet Whitby's bell tower had been silent since 1999. The sound emanated from within these walls, each peal vibrating marrow. I burst into the great hall. The unlit lantern still burned, but its flame now cast double shadows, one obeying me, the other lagging, delaying each gesture. When I lifted my hand, its echo rose a heartbeat late, fingers splayed wide. The two silhouettes overlapped, and for an instant my arm felt pulled by an undertow. "Henry will be here at dawn," I muttered, voice frayed. "Keep moving." A portrait crashed from the balcony, exploding glass across the flagstones. Beneath gilded shards lay Lady Elspeth's face. Canvas slit down the center. From the tear seeped something darker than paint, an inky stain that crept along the floor like blood denied gravity. It reached the lantern's glow and reared upright into a woman-shaped void, veil of ash, eyes twin-coin black holes. I staggered back. Cold struck my chest like a plunged knife, breath fogged. The void advanced, feet never touching stone, trailing whispers that sounded like my name. Not rational, not photographic, primal. I bolted for the entry arch, past the yawning main doors, out to the cliff path. North Sea wind slapped rain sideways, the soil greedy beneath every step. Yet the church bells tolled on, each note heavier, slower, now inside my skull.
Halfway to the gate, I heard a second set of footsteps matching mine, though the gravel showed only one track. The echo drew closer until breath, damp and sweet with peat smoke, warmed my nape. "Stay with me," it pleaded, in my own voice. I turned. No figure stood there, only my shadow, but dressed in Victorian morning black, veil fluttering in salt wind. Its gloved hand rose, mirroring mine, then pressed against my chest. Ice tunneled through skin to heart. I could not scream. The air thickened like seawater in my throat. Lightning fanned across the clouds, revealing Ravensbrook Hall silhouetted against churning waves. For one pulse of white light, every shattered window gleamed, and dozens of silhouettes watched, each wearing my face. The bells fell silent. The wind died. My shadow's hand slid away, yet the chill remained, coiling within like a second spine. I ran again, reached the wrought iron gate as Henry's headlights crested the lane. He shouted my name. I tried to answer, but only a thin rasp emerged, like fabric brushing past. Behind me, Ravensbrook's lanterns winked out, one by one, until only the chapel window glowed faintly, reflecting the cliff's edge. In that dim pane I saw two figures, Henry in the courtyard, and beside him a woman in tattered black lace. She raised a hand in farewell. I felt my own arm float up unbidden, answering her wave. Henry thinks shock stole my voice that night. He never smelled peat smoke or heard bells. Yet sometimes, just before sleep, I taste ashes and salt, and in the dark mirror across my hotel room I glimpse a silhouette that moves half a beat behind me, veil whispering against unseen wood. How long before the cadence matches and we step in time?
The title of the story echoes under Saint-Luc Seminary. I never believed the dead could speak until the night their voices found mine at Saint-Luc Seminary on the lonely south bank of the St. Lawrence River. 31 years old I Ivy Caldwell, oral history podcaster from Bangor, Maine, had crossed the border that gray afternoon chasing content for a Halloween episode. I wanted atmosphere, the hush of abandoned corridors, the creak that sells authenticity to listeners wearing earbuds in dark bedrooms. René Beaumont, the last living stonemason who worked here, was 84, tight-lipped, and smelled of cedar sawdust. He handed me the iron key, warned, "Do not go below the chapel, mademoiselle," then drove away, leaving his taillights bleeding into fog. The facade loomed, a neo-Gothic silhouette of cracked spires and chiseled gargoyles streaked green with lichen. When I turned the key, the oak doors groaned like a ship's hull, releasing a sharp scent of extinguished incense mixed with the must of drowned books. My recorder purred to life. I announced into the mic, "Saint-Luc Seminary, shuttered since the fire of January 29th, 1923. Official death toll, 5. Unofficial disappearances, 14 novices." For a moment, nothing stirred. Only distant river wind hissed through broken mullioned windows. It felt honest, almost peaceful, exactly what I wanted my audience to hear.
The nave stretched before me like a throat swallowing lamplight. Frost-veined stained glass fractured the moon into bruised blues and sickly yellows that skittered across pews charred black as bone. I described each detail for the mic, voice steady though my pulse throbbed in my ears. Near the altar, a marble Christ lay toppled, face sheared clean off. I knelt to capture the sound of my fingers brushing gypsum dust. Behind me, something clicked, heel on wood. I spun, empty aisle. The click ceased the instant I froze. "Building, settling," I whispered, as though reassurance needed recording. I crossed into the refectory. Long tables bowed under drifts of ash. My breath plumed, white and ragged. The seminary had no glass left to hold heat. The recorder picked up faint breathing, not in time with mine. I replayed the clip. 2 inhalations where I made 1. I laughed, brittle. "Echo," I told the darkness. Echoes should not smell. Yet a sudden acrid tang of burned beeswax, the unmistakable scent of candles snuffed in haste, coiled around me. Far above, the bell tower skeleton jutted skyward. Its bronze heart melted in the 23 blaze. Still, at 10:06 p.m. by my watch, one low bell tolled. Not a rustle, not a trick of wind, but a sonorous, perfect knell vibrating through the flagstones into my boots. I hurried into the sacristy, walls lined with empty reliquary niches. On the far door, René's warning echoed, "Do not go below the chapel." I told my listeners his words, adding journalistic bravado. Of course, I have to see why. The stairwell was a slit in the wall, its treads of wet slate glistening like fish hides. As I descended, each step shuddered, either beneath my weight
or beneath something stirring deeper still. Stone swallowed the moonlight. I switched on my lantern. Its beam shook with my hands.
Beneath the chapel lay a corridor of barrel-vaulted brick, damp enough to weep black rivulets. On hooks hammered into mortar, cassocks hung, rows and rows of student robes, cuffs crusted with soot, forming a pendulum forest that rocked though the air was still. I raised my mic. Fabric whispered, sleeves brushing one another as if invisible arms still filled them. Halfway along, a niche opened into a cell where a single candle burned, wick drowning in fresh wax. No draughts should exist this deep, yet its flame bent toward me as though breathing. My brain seized the obvious question, who lit it? Recording, I muttered, if someone's here, I'm press... The candle snuffed. Instant darkness pitched the corridor into black water silence. I slapped the lantern. Its bulb sputtered and died. Only the recorder's red LED remained, blinking like a dying heartbeat. In that breathing hush, the choir began. At first, a single voice, baritone, chanting in archaic Latin I half recognized from Catholic funerals. Another joined, then another, stacking into impossible harmony until the passage quaked with a chorus of young male voices. The Latin words formed my name, Eva called well, elongated, exalted, accusatory. I backed away, shoulder blades skimming cold brick. My foot struck something soft. The lantern's afterglow revealed a novice's journal, cover blistered. Inside, the last entry dated January 28th, 1923. Renee says the foundation stones hum at night. We will follow the music downward. If we do not return, may our voices stay to swell the hymn. Renee, my living witness, written here as a teenage artisan the night before the fire. The discovery pierced my professional detachment. My hands trembled so fiercely the recorder clacked against my teeth. Renee lied. The choir swelled, closer now as if pressing against thin air. Something rippled across the floor, long shadows with no bodies, and the cassocks lifted from their hooks, sleeves spreading like black wings. I bolted, but the way back seemed longer than before, corridor bending, receding. The lantern's bulb flickered to life just once, revealing the stairwell mouth, now walled by fresh-laid bricks, mortar still wet. My chest hit the barrier, warm mortar smeared under my palms. Someone or something was entombing me from the other side. I hammered with both fists. Stone answered with the scrape of trowel on brick. From beyond the wall, Renee's aged voice whispered in French, "Forgive us. The choir must have a conductor."
Panic knifed thought. I spun, seeking any exit. The choir surged in volume, raw and jubilant. No longer boys, but men returned from fire, tongues scorched to ruin. Latin fractured into English. Stay, sing, breathe ashes. I ran deeper. The corridor forked into a crypt lined with burial niches. Marble plaques bore names of the missing: Etienne, Luc, Gabriel, and, carved recently, Ivy Caldwell. My breath snagged. Behind me, stone grated. Another wall sealed the passage I'd entered. Tomb to tomb, the seminary was laying bricks faster than thought, orchestrated by invisible masons chanting in perfect 4/4 time. I hit record and screamed, "This is Ivy Caldwell, Saint-Luc Seminary. If anyone finds this." A blast of furnace heat whooshed past, searing my face. In its wake materialized 14 silhouettes. Heads hooded, habits ember red at the hems. The nearest lifted his cowl. There was no flesh, only churning ash assembling into features, then falling away in smoky tears. He opened a mouthless gap, and my own voice poured out, the earlier field notes I'd spoken in the nave, playing backward. The realization struck like ice. They were not imitating me. They were emptying me. Each whispered phrase stolen, leaving hollows in memory. My recording career, my stories, erased for their liturgy.
I lunged toward a rusted service ladder, rising to a grate. Climbing, I felt hands of ash claw my boots, not pulling me down, but steadying me, ushering rather than restraining. At the top, the grate was welded shut. The choir gathered below, humming a single sustained note that vibrated the ladder into a tuning fork. Language unraveled. My name lost syllables in my mind. I, Vi. The recorder slipped from numb fingers, clattering beside the cassocks far below. As it hit, the red LED blinked faster, capturing the last thing I would give the world, my ragged breath and a final scraping, stone sealing stone. The latter dissolved to soot beneath me. I fell, yet never struck the floor. Instead, cold cloth enveloped my shoulders, the waiting cassock settling onto my frame. Voices thundered approval. The candle relit, haloing the choir, whose numbers had grown by 1. That is where the episode ends, when my producer airs the recovered file every Halloween. Listeners debate if the screams are mine or some clever sound design. They ask why the bell tolls again at the final timestamp, 10:06 p.m., though St. Luke's bell was melted a century ago. No answer arises from the river mist. Only the seminary remains, doors newly mortared shut, a faint chant leaking through cracks like breath through a grave, promising that the story is still being told, down where the recording light will blink forever, red and patient in the dark.
The title of the story, The Last Bell of Saint-Armand. I never believed an empty room could pronounce a name until the moment Saint-Armand Seminary whispered mine. That Tuesday, the sky above the Richelieu River hung the color of forged iron, spitting sleet that glazed every rooftop in the Quebec village. I, Ethan Carter, doctoral candidate in architectural acoustics at MIT, had come to catalogue
how ruined sanctuaries distort sound. Professor Robert Lamont, a retired field recorder with more frost than hair, first told me about the seminary over lukewarm coffee in Boston. You want a building that still breathes? Go where the novices burned. So I crossed the border with a backpack of microphones and a heart full of skepticism. Saint-Armand Seminary showed itself like a bruise on the riverbank, aged limestone walls veined with soot, chiseled gargoyles drooling rain, and a bell tower tilting as if listening for confession. Frost filmed every mullioned pane, silvering them into blind mirrors. The wrought iron gates groaned open at my touch. No lock, only centuries of rust surrendering. Inside, the air tasted of damp ash and extinguished incense. Charred pews lay toppled like fallen dominoes across a stone nave wide enough to swallow my footsteps. Yet I felt oddly welcome, as though the ruin had inhaled and paused for my arrival. I planted my first condenser mic on the cracked marble of the central aisle. The recorder's LED pulsed green. Silence, save for distant river ice shifting. An everyday beginning.
By dusk, the nave dimmed to bruise purple. I worked methodically, one mic beneath the choir loft, another near the collapsed apse, two in the side corridors where novices once slept. My research notes rustled in the draft that seeped through dislocated stones. The building breathed exactly as textbooks said it should. Thermal currents sighing through voids, timbers flexing with falling temperature. Textbook comfort. Until 6:11 p.m. I was spooling cable when the side chapel door, padlocked minutes earlier, banged wide with a pistol crack. My light sliced through whirling dust. Nobody. Only an iron flicker of something skittering out of view. I blamed wind and logged the anomaly. At 7:08 p.m., the church bells tolled. 3 resonant notes glided through the rafters, low and cold as lake water. My whole body startled. The seminary's bell wheel had been photographed, warped and split, frozen in the tower like a broken jaw. I sprinted upstairs. The belfry ladder was laced with icicles. The wheel lay exactly as history promised, jagged, immobile. Yet my recorder downstairs captured the chimes, their waveform perfect. I descended shakier than I'd climbed. In the nave, shadows elongated beyond reason, warping under my headlamp like tar seeking downhill. I set a parabolic mic in the center aisle and spoke a test phrase. Carter, Channel 2. The stone-vaulted roof gave my surname back in a hush. Carter. R. Nothing odd there. Ordinary reverberation. But then the recorder needle leapt again, scribbling a bass note beneath my spoken consonants, too deep for human throat or damaged bell.
9:07 p.m. I took supper. Cold coffee and energy bar inside the refectory. Walls still blackened from the 1924 fire. The scent of burned sugar wafted through, impossible yet unmistakable, as if the novice's dessert simmered anew. My flashlight faltered.
batteries drained twice the normal rate. In its weak circle, I read Latin graffiti scratched into a beam. Vox manet. The voice remains. My palms prickled with sweat. Back in the nave, I replayed the latest capture. Under my voice hid a child's litany, soft, precise Latin responses, the kind sung during Vespers. I boosted the track. A soprano no older than 12 repeated Ora pro nobis, Ethan Carter. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air densely occupied. I forced a laugh and addressed the dark. "All right, you have my attention. Carter, Channel 3. The answer was immediate. A flock of whispers roused along the nave like wind through raven feathers. Somewhere underfoot, floorboards nibbled by fire decades ago creaked as if bearing weight. I pivoted. My light cut across saintly statues, melted into shapeless lumps, their marble faces now blank. Yet a fresh gleam, wet and sorrowing, shone where eyes should have been. 10:47 p.m. My recorder spiked. A sub-bass rumble shivered dust from the choir loft. One continuous bell note, deeper than any steeple could produce. It lasted longer than breath, longer than heartbeat. Within the vibration, threads of harmony unfurled, scores of voices chanting Ethan Carter in measureless unison. The sound was not warning, it was invocation. I knew the building's plan. Below the nave, a crypt tunneled toward the riverbank. Historical records claimed novices slept in stone cells there for Lenten penance. I steeled myself and followed the vibration.
11:23 p.m. The crypt stair yawned beneath the trap door behind the altar, its hinges shrieking like pigs led to slaughter. Cold climbed each step first, I followed, breath turning to vapor halos that hung unwilling to disperse. My headlamp revealed walls oozing black mold that resembled musical notation, accidental staffs weeping from ceiling to floor. The corridor ended at a wooden door buckled by time. My surname pulsed again through the stone, louder now, syllables braided with that endless bell. I pushed, the door fell inward with a sigh. The chamber beyond was small, its ceiling arched like a rib cage. On a plinth of cracked limestone rested a memorial plaque, mottled green with corrosion. I lifted my lamp, letters resolved through centuries of grime. Ethan Michael Carter. Born 1996, died 29 October 2024. Vox Monat. My throat locked. The portrait above, oval, oil on slate, showed a young man in 19th century clerical garb. Yet the line of the jaw, the scar on the right brow, the very mole on the neck were mine. Paint peeled from eyelids that seemed on the verge of blinking.
Behind me, the door edged shut, moved by no visible hand. The chamber swallowed my exhale. Then a footstep, soft leather on stone, approached from the pitch beside the plaque. I swung the lamp. No figure appeared, yet the footstep persisted, circling me in deliberate orbit, as if an unseen novice counted stations of prayer. The bell note rose a whole octave, vibrating through bone, loosening mortar. Dust rained like pale confetti. My recorder, in my pocket now, flared red, capturing decibels beyond safe thresholds. Amid the roar, a single voice separated, younger than the rest, pleading inside my skull. Trade places, the voice remains. A hand I could not see gripped my left wrist, ice cold, undeniably real. Reflex seized me, I bolted. The invisible grip tore but slipped away. Skin beneath my sleeve, mottling white where fingers had pressed. I slammed the chamber door, sprinted the tunnel, and took the stair 3 at a time. As I burst into the nave, every microphone cable writhed like living wire, tangling my ankles. The overturned pews had rearranged into twin aisles leading toward the main doors, as though offering an exit. Yet between me and freedom hung air thick with swirling soot that coalesced, moment by moment, into a juvenile silhouette holding a censer. He raised the brass orb. Smoke ribboned from its vents, spelling faint script, Vox Manet. I lunged sideways, tearing free of cables, and rushed the doors. They parted without protest. Outside, the river wind knifed my lungs clean. I sprinted to the rental car, engine stalling twice before it caught. Headlights slashed the facade of Saint-Armand's Seminary. The gargoyles seemed closer to the ground.
I left Saint-Armand at 11:59 p.m. Bell note still thrumming in my ears, though the tower stayed mute. 40 kilometers south, I stopped on a rural shoulder to steady my hands. The recorder lay on the passenger seat, LEDs dark. I pressed play. Silence. Then, faint but certain, my own voice, yet not from earlier, spoke through the speaker, brittle as distant radio. I remain. Behind it, a single church bell chimed midnight. I jerked my head toward the empty back seat, half expecting a novice in scorched cassock. Nothing. Only the tick of cooling engine metal and, carried by the wind from the north, the dying tale of that impossible bell. Have you ever driven through country darkness, knowing a building miles behind you is whispering your name, louder the farther you flee? I have. And when the bell fell silent at last, I could not tell if it was because I'd outrun the sound, or because the seminary no longer needed to call me home.